Okay, can we start? I'm Stephanie Barrientos from the Global Development Institute, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Rhys Jenkins. Rhys Jenkins is a professor of development economics at the University of East Anglia. He's done, over many years, extensive research on Latin America and China and other parts of the world. He looks at various dimensions, but particularly in relation to sort of industrial development, trade, social development, and different dimensions of the kind of process. And very importantly, I think he's also a long-standing friend of the University of Manchester. He's been engaged with the university, with GDI over very many years, and we've also had a number over the years, many research collaborations, both here and in other institutions. Rhys is going to give a lecture on how China is reshaping the global economy, but really important, and even more important, or as important, or whichever. This is based on his new book, which is recently published, which is really looking at different dimensions from different sort of social, political, and economic dimensions of the relationship between China, Latin America, and Africa, amongst other countries. I would really recommend the book. It's published by Oxford University Press. It's also available in the library. But without further ado, I'd just like to introduce Rhys Jenkins.
Right, thank you very much, Stephanie. And just in case I forgot to bring the book, I put this as the first page of the presentation of today's lecture. I'm very pleased to be here, and thanks for the invitation to speak at the GDI. As Stephanie said, I've had sort of a long relationship with Manchester and have many friends and colleagues here. I mean, in terms of the genesis of this book, it's been rather long drawn out. I started working on issues of the impact of China on the global south about 15 years ago, having worked on globalization issues more generally before that, and becoming aware of the fact that, you know, an increasingly key actor in terms of globalization was China. I decided to do the book about 5 years ago, and now I'm faced with having to try and well, not exactly summarize, but put across some themes that took me 400 pages. It was originally going to be 200 pages, but the book rather grew out of all proportion. So that's what I'm trying to do in 3/4 of an hour and 50 minutes. Just in case you can't stick through to the end, this is what I want to talk about. I'm going to start with a sort of overview of two common perspectives on relations between China and Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. I then want to, because I think there's so much misinformation, if you like, or partial information, I want to try and look at some of these economic relations in more detail and try and disaggregate them a bit, looking at the key ways in which China is involved with countries in the two regions. And then to try and say a bit about why I think these relationships are somewhat different in Latin America and in Africa. I say Africa and Latin America as shorthand. I'm really talking about Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. But one of the points that I would make is that there's a lack of reliable data and information on China's involvement, which makes it difficult, but also makes it important to try and look at these relations in some detail. Okay. Well, one view of China, which I've characterized as the official Chinese view, and the view that supporters of that position hold, and is set out in two policy papers that the Chinese government had put out, two on Africa, two on Latin America, over the last 10 or 12 years. And what comes across these is the similarity between the way that relations with Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa are presented in a very kind of positive light, obviously, and stress the complementarity between China and the Chinese economy and the economies of sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. A common theme is the emphasis on how these relations are very different from the relations that the West has with those regions, sometimes referring to common histories of oppression in China and in Africa particularly. And of course, a major theme is that China does not impose conditionalities or interfere in the internal affairs of countries, that they should find their own paths to development. So that's a very positive view of China's relationship with the Global South and with the two regions I'm concerned with. On the other hand, of course, as I'm sure you're very aware, that there's a highly critical perception of China's involvement in the West, from the West, of its involvement in the Global South. That is particularly prevalent amongst some Western leaders and politicians, and also often presented in the media, which I'd summarize as being the view of China as being a new neo-colonial or new imperialist power in the two regions. And I've got a couple of quotes there from, to illustrate the very common use of terms about colonialism in relation to both China's involvement in Africa and in Latin America. So the growth of China's economic relations with the two regions is really seen as a threat to Western interests. China's presented as being basically interested in extracting resources from Africa and China and Latin America to fuel its own growth. Recently, it's been pictured as trying to trap countries into a dependent relationship based on debt and investments. And again, I mean, the point that I want to make about this picture is that there's really no differentiation or no distinction between the relations that China has with Latin America and its relations with sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, well, that's by way of preamble to try and see where I might be coming from. I want to talk now about some of the relationships, some similarities and some differences. And as I say, I'm focusing on these economic links between China and the two regions. Right. This is in terms of trade. The blue lines are Latin America, the red lines sub-Saharan Africa. And the solid lines are the total trade between China and the two regions. So you can see, substantial growth in trade, obviously, with a blip with the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009, another blip from 2014 with the collapse in world commodity prices. Given that, in Britain at least, there's much more attention given to relations between China and Africa than China and Latin America, you might be slightly surprised to see that the blue line for Latin America is above the red line, the solid ones. In other words, China does more trade with Latin America than it does with Africa. On the other hand, if you look at the dotted lines, those are looked at from the point of view of Latin America and of Africa. One can see that a bigger share of African trade is with China than Latin American trade. So although, if you like, Latin America is more important for China than Africa in terms of the total amount of trade. China is more important for Africa than Latin America. Again, of course, you can see that these have increased over time. One reason, I might just mention, why the share of trade with China is much greater or lower in Latin America than it is in Africa is because it tends to be lower in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean countries, which have more trade with the US, obviously. Okay. What's traded? Well, there is certainly truth in the picture that says basically what Latin America and Africa export to China are primary products. Okay. Manufactured goods, which are the green part, make up less than 5% of African exports to China and just over 10% of Latin American exports. So the bulk of exports in both regions are primary commodities. But when you dig below that and look at what's being exported, you can see that the sort of yellow area is the big one in the case of Africa, and that is oil. And in fact, this is since the drop in oil prices, so that earlier periods, half of African exports to China, or more than half, were, in value terms, was oil. In Latin America, you can see it's only about a sixth of all exports to China are made up of oil. Mining accounts for a significant share in both cases, although in Africa, diamonds and gold are more significant. But the other main difference is if you look at the blue area, and out to the brown area, but mainly in the blue area, the light blue, that is much, which is foodstuffs, that is much more significant for Latin America, because the major part of that is exports of soybeans to China, which has been a major export. So agricultural products, which are a very minor part of African exports to China, are much more significant, a substantial part of Chinese imports from Latin America. The other difference I would note is to do with the trade balance, and that's something that's not often highlighted, but for much of this period, China has had a trade deficit with Africa, i.e. its imports more from Africa than it exports to Africa, whereas the reverse was true in the case of Latin America. China has a trade surplus with Latin America. That's changed as far as Africa is concerned because of the big drop in commodity prices for the last 2 or 3 years. China's had a trade surplus with Africa as well, but that's been a result of the drop in commodity prices. In general, what one sees from that is that the exports are more important for China to Latin America because Latin America, the reason for that is that Latin America is more important as a market, which I'll come back to later on. Of course, one of the problems with discussing the two regions in this way is that they're made up of, over 50 countries in Africa and 30 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And of course, when one goes behind these aggregate figures, they're made up of a few countries which China has a large trade deficit with, and a large number of countries in which it is a trade surplus, but this is just the overall balance for the region as a whole. Okay, so that's as far as trade is concerned. Let me turn to Chinese investment in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, because that was in a relatively small scale when I first started looking at these economic relations, but has grown since the early 2000s. There are lots of problems with the reliability of information on foreign investment, Chinese foreign investment. In fact, it's a nightmare. One of the problems, if any of you have studied Chinese foreign investment, is that outward investment from China is, where it goes to is where it goes to first of all. So the statistics that you get on Chinese foreign investment, as a standard practice with IMF's statistics on foreign investment, will only tell you where the first destination is. The problem as far as Chinese investment is concerned is the first destinations of China, the major destinations of Chinese investment are Hong Kong, the British Virgin Islands, and the Cayman Islands. So these are not where the investment ends up. One knows that the Caribbean is not having masses of real investment. These are just tax havens which are transit for investment elsewhere. So one doesn't really know where the Chinese investment is going to ultimately. Quite interesting that Brazil, the central bank in Brazil, tried to analyze the extent of this phenomenon, and they found that when they looked at investment by Chinese-owned firms in Brazil, as opposed to the official figures of investment that had come directly from China. So if they took investment that came through other countries, but was made by Chinese firms via their subsidiaries in other countries, and this was 10 times as much, only as the declared official figures of Chinese investment. So one can see that these problems of measuring Chinese investment. As a result, if the official figures are not to be relied upon, then people have tried to use announcements about foreign investment from media sources and so on. The American Enterprise Institute has something called the China Global Investment Tracker, which tries to look at all Chinese investments of over $100 million around the world and record all of those. But again, of course, that has a number of problems. Firstly, it's not uncommon for projects to be announced, but they never get carried out. So it may exaggerate the amount of investment that's taking place. On the other hand, there are problems of it not capturing small-scale investments of less than 100 million. So, as I said, it's a bit of a nightmare trying to get any figures on foreign investment from China. These are the two sets of figures that I've tried to present there. I mean, all I can say really, I think, is that they're of the same order of magnitude in sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America, without being able to put very precise figures on. You can say that there's sub-Saharan Africa and China and Latin America get about the same amount of investment from China. But again, if one looked at it in relation to total investment, foreign investment in the two regions, Latin America gets about 4 times as much foreign investment as China does, as Africa does. So relatively, China is much more important as a source of foreign investment is much more important as a source of foreign investment for Africa. It's about, on official figures, it's the 5th largest investor in Africa. It doesn't appear within the top 10 investors in Latin America. So one can see that, again, as with trade, China is more important for sub-Saharan Africa than it is for Latin America, even though, I wouldn't swear by the figures. What other differences are there? Well, the sectors seem quite similar at first sight. the major sectors that foreign investment from China is involved in is energy and mining. Now, that might seem to suggest that this picture of China extracting resources from the two regions is quite accurate, that this is what Chinese firms are doing. But when you look at what investment in energy is, particularly in Latin America, a lot of the energy investments is going into producing energy for Latin America. Same is true to some extent in Africa as well. But, you know, one of the major Chinese investors in Latin America is State Grid, which has big investments in power generation and transmission in Brazil. Now, this is not extracting resources from Brazil, it's actually providing energy domestically in the Brazilian market. And the same is true whether there's been investment into hydropower plants. Another point that I make, and again, this is where the data is particularly problematic, but my impression is that private investment, particularly small-scale private investment, is much more significant in Africa than it is in Latin America. On the other hand, where you've got large-scale mergers and acquisitions, takeovers of firms by Chinese companies, that's much more significant in Latin America. So that 60%, according to one source, of Chinese investment in Latin America actually involves taking over other firms, whereas less than 10% of Chinese investment in Africa is through mergers and acquisitions. Okay, a third type of relationship, which is distinct from foreign investment, is where there are Chinese firms engaged in construction projects abroad. And that doesn't count as foreign investment because it's not a permanent presence in the foreign market. It's more, if you like, it's a kind of trade in services, but particularly around construction and engineering projects. China refers to this as economic cooperation in its own statistics. Now again, if we look at the red and the blue lines, the blue is Latin America, and the red is Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa, you can see that there is substantially more, in value terms, Chinese involvement in Africa than in Latin America in these type of projects. Okay. And indeed, Chinese firms, it's been estimated, account for about half of international infrastructure, engineering, construction, procurement internationally in Africa, whereas it's only about 10% or less than 10% of all the projects in Latin America. So there's been a very major difference in terms of involvement in those kind of large-scale projects, which, as I'll say later, reflects a much longer history of Chinese engagement with Africa than Latin America. Again, I've got some figures on illustrating the sectors. I'm not sure how clear this is, but to illustrate the sectors that are involved in two major sectors, energy and transport, in both cases. Within the inner circles, this blue is energy, the brown is transport. But you can also observe that their significance is reversed, that transport is more significant in Africa, whereas energy projects, I mean by energy project, I'm talking about not just oil or coal, but also power plants, hydroelectric power, and so on. Energy is more important in Latin America than transport. And then on the outer circle, you've got a disaggregation of what these are. And you can see that the major energy project in hydropower, and in terms of transport, one can also see the two major sectors, railways and roads. I mean, this is actually says autos, but in fact it's roads, essentially. And again, railway is more important in sub-Saharan Africa. Roads are more important in Latin America, relatively. Okay. So we've talked about trade, we've talked about foreign investment, we've talked about projects. Another way which is China's been economically involved with both regions, and this is quite closely linked to projects, but not exclusively linked to it, is through loans. So again, problems of data. China doesn't present any breakdown of its lending to different regions or different countries. So the information that we have on Chinese lending comes from researchers who've tried to put together figures on announcements made of Chinese loans at the Center for African CARI, the Chinese Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University, who've produced data on Africa, and the Inter-American Dialogue, Boston University, has produced this data on Latin America. So again, it's only captures large-scale lending, and it's not entirely reliable, but it's the only data that's available. Again, all I'm trying to show with this is that, the sort of general amount of loans that one's getting, the figures seem to be quite similar between the two regions. We're talking about, as with foreign investment, we're talking about similar orders of magnitude. But again, it's much more significant for Africa, because Africa finds it much more difficult to get loans than Latin America. So that relatively, once more, Africa would seem to be more dependent on Chinese borrowing from China than it is for borrowing than is Latin America. The kind of pattern of loans is very similar to the pattern of projects concentrated on energy and infrastructure, which would include transport. And one other feature that if you looked at these issues you'll be familiar with is the tendency for China to use so-called commodity-backed loans, or resources for infrastructure loans, where the repayment of loans made by Chinese policy banks to countries in the global south are guaranteed, as it were, against exports of commodities, often oil, mainly oil, but also in some cases others, minerals, or even agricultural products. I think in the case of Ghana, some cocoa. So the idea is that greater security is obtained, as far as the lender is concerned, by ensuring that the repayment will get made in commodities rather than having to rely on financial payments. And one estimate is that about half of the loans in both, I think this was a few years ago, about half of the loans to both Latin America and to sub-Saharan Africa were commodity-backed, were that way. What's sometimes referred to as the Angola mode of lending, because it was first used by China, I think, in Angola. So there are similarities, obviously, in lending, but there are some differences as well. If you cut, loans includes different types of things, particularly in some cases aid, official development assistance, and in other cases other official finance, other types of loans, export credits, and other commercial financing. Now, in that case, it's much more significant. The aid proportion is much more significant in Africa. About 40% of total Chinese financing to Africa is in terms of aid, whereas that's less than 20% in Latin America. And there are also differences in terms of who lends. I mean, China has two main so-called policy banks who are responsible for state loans for development and for export promotion. The Export-Import Bank, Exim Bank, and the China Development Bank. And in Africa, the main lender is the Export-Import Bank, the Exim Bank. It lends about 4 or 5 times as much to Africa as the CDB. Whereas in Latin America, the relationship is the reverse. CDB has lent about 4 or 5 times as much as the Exim Bank. Now, this is partly related to the fact that I observed earlier that official development assistance goes through the Exim Bank, so that aid and all concessional lending is through the Exim Bank, whereas the CDB doesn't provide subsidized loans, doesn't provide concessional lending. So that's another significant difference. Okay. Another difference, and again, I'm sorry, I've got increasingly frustrated, maybe you've got increasingly frustrated, when I keep saying that it's difficult to get data on this, and it's another area where it's difficult to get data on, is the extent of Chinese migration to the different regions, where there's very little data, or what data there is massively underestimates, or the hard data, official figures, underestimate the true level. And of course, that's partly because a lot of migration is often undocumented. But there are estimates that maybe as many as 2 million Chinese migrants in sub-Saharan Africa. The figures for Latin America tend to be less than 1 million, but again, these are very approximate, rough estimates. What there is more information on, and what is presented in this figure, is the extent to which there are Chinese workers on projects or labor service contracts in the two regions. And again, one can see that it's more significant in Africa, the blue and the red, first two columns for Africa, than it is in Latin America. So there's much more actual direct labor employed on Chinese projects, partly because there are more Chinese projects, as we saw earlier, in Africa than in Latin America. And this, of course, was one of the concerns that has been raised in relation to China's involvement in Africa, has been about the extent to which Chinese labor is used, although one can see here that in recent years that's actually been declining. The numbers have actually fallen in recent years for various reasons, partly because of the increasing cost of getting workers from China as wages have increased in China, partly because there's been a slowdown or a decline in economic activity in Africa, and partly because Chinese companies have got more experience of working with local workers, so are less prone to try and import workers from China. Now, I've talked about the sort of objective relations, if you like, in terms of the links between China and Latin America and Africa. I wanted to sort of finish this comparative bit by looking at what information we have about how China is viewed in the two regions. And the striking thing here is the countries at the top here, the Latin American countries, a smaller proportion of respondents to these surveys, which are carried out by the Pew Center, the Global Attitude Survey, smaller proportion in Latin America have a positive view of China than in Africa. If you take the average overall, the average for Latin America is less than 60% viewing China in a favorable or very favorable light, which is what these percentages represent. Whereas in Africa, 70% of respondents regarded China favorably or very favorably. The one outlier, as far as Africa is concerned, is South Africa, where it's a much less favorable view of China, much more like the view of China in major Latin American countries. Now, why might that be the case? Well, the Pew survey doesn't give you any information of that, but there was an interesting survey done by Afrobarometer in Africa at about the same time as this survey, around 2015, which shows that the main reason why African respondents had a positive view of China were because of Chinese infrastructure building in Africa and because of cheap Chinese products. So these were the two things that people who had a favorable view of China in Africa tended to give as the reasons why they had this positive view. And the interesting thing about that is that these are economic reasons. It relates to the kind of analysis of economic relations. It's not because they have political perceptions of China. It's because they think that China has had economic benefits, either because it's built roads and hospitals and other types of investment in infrastructure, or because Chinese products have meant that they can, has meant a real rise in their living standards because it's reduced the cost of goods. Okay. Right. Now I'll dispense with sort of diagrams in case any of you are allergic to diagrams. Let me try to make a more speculative account of, well, why are there such differences between China's involvement in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa? And my first point is that it's not really because the drivers of Chinese engagement in the two regions are particularly different. I mean, I'll talk here about three main categories of drivers that underlie China's growing involvement in the two regions: the strategic objectives, economic objectives of the Chinese state, which are to do with access to raw materials and to do with access to markets, and generally the go global policy that China's pursued since the early 2000s, trying to support and build up major Chinese global companies. There are certain strategic political objectives that the Chinese state has, of course, particularly in relation to Taiwan and getting countries to recognize China under the Beijing, under the One China policy, and increasing China's soft power. But there are also crucially commercial objectives of Chinese and indeed non-Chinese businesses, which is also because, when you're talking about exports of soybeans from Latin America or trade between Africa and China, a lot of the actors are not Chinese. They're, major agribusinesses, or they're individual traders, African traders and so on. And they're pursuing commercial objectives. So these kind of drivers are very similar in both regions. So what's the difference? I mean, why might things play out differently in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa? And I try to explain this in terms of various factors. First of all, in terms of the different history and geopolitics. As I hinted at before, maybe I didn't, but it's certainly true that, we're not going back to sort of, hundreds of years, but it's certainly true that relations between the People's Republic of China and Africa have a longer time frame than relations with Latin America. China established relations with a number of Latin American countries, African countries as they became independent in the 1960s. They recognized China. And when China replaced Taiwan in the Chinese seat in the UN Security Council in 1971, it did so with the support from a lot of African countries. Latin America at that point, I mean, until 1970, the only Latin American country that had diplomatic relations with Beijing was Cuba after the revolution. So, the Latin American countries were much later in establishing diplomatic relations with China, and there are still 9 Latin American countries which still recognize Taiwan, even after 3 changed in the last sort of 2 or 3 years, compared to only 1 country in sub-Saharan Africa. So the history of political relations is longer drawn out, and the economic involvement as well is more sustained in terms of Africa, going back to the pre-reformed Deng Xiaoping reforms in China, started in the late 1970s. You know, even in the Maoist period, there was involvement of Chinese aid and Chinese construction companies in Africa, and nothing like that in Latin America. So you've had much longer-term relationships with certain consequences. Obviously, there are differences in levels of development between Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa as well, both in terms of higher income levels in Latin America. Latin American income's about 4 times, I think, GDP per capita, 4 or 5 times higher than the sub-Saharan Africa. So obviously, this might partly explains why Latin America is more important as a market for China. And also the fact that Latin America is more industrialized than sub-Saharan Africa. I think manufacturing value added per head of population is 20 times higher in Latin America than it is in Africa, and more technologically advanced. So, as I said, Latin America is more significant as a market. There's been more of an impact, of a negative impact on manufacturing industries in Latin America than in Africa. There's not been the same appeal of Chinese technologies in Latin America that there has been in Africa. And on the other hand, where there's been investment, there are fewer opportunities for mergers and acquisitions in Africa than in Latin America, because there's just not the same kind of prior level of development. There's also, of course, critical differences in the way in which countries have been inserted into the global economy. I mean, Africa has been marginalized, particularly in terms of capital flows and in terms of financial flows and foreign direct investment, which is why it's not that China has particularly targeted its lending to Africa as opposed to Latin America. It's rather that countries that haven't been able to borrow anywhere else have borrowed from China. And there are more of those countries in Africa than in Latin America. There's also the fact that, of course, as I hinted earlier, Latin American countries have been more integrated, particularly countries in Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean have been more integrated with the US economy, so that they don't depend so much on trade with China. And there are differences in the specialization of economies. More Latin American economies became exporters and manufacturers, whereas that was not generally the case in sub-Saharan Africa. Which has differences in terms of the way, both the direct and indirect impacts that China had on, or China's integration into the global economy had on those countries. There are also some differences in terms of Chinese actors. I think one has to get away from the picture of China as being a monolithic actor in overseas, although perhaps, you know, the portrayal yesterday of the celebration of the 70th anniversary tended to try to project a view of China as a kind of, you know, homogenous entity under the rule of the Communist Party. I don't think that's necessarily a useful way of trying to analyze these economic relations because of the involvement of different kind of Chinese actors in different parts of the world, or particularly in this case between Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. And so there are differences in terms of the extent to which different regions access concessional loans, differences in terms of the extent to which infrastructure development has characterized a central part of the relationship. And in some cases, of course, what one gets is that there are conflicts between the interests of individual actors and the interests of the Chinese state. I mean, one can think of cases, for example, in Ghana, where there were a lot of illegal gold miners came from China and were then eventually expelled by the Ghanaians. That obviously didn't sort of go very well with attempts by the Chinese state to expand its soft power to present itself as a friend and a mutually beneficial kind of contributor to development in Ghana. So you get these kind of conflicts once you start digging underneath this kind of picture of a homogeneous China operating in Africa. Okay. The last difference that I want to try and highlight, I think, is in terms of local agency. I mean, part of the problem which writers about China's involvement in two regions is now becoming increasingly aware of, is that you can't just see what happens in Africa or in Latin America as being the result of a kind of bulldozer China, without taking into account local agency and way in which governments, states, and civil society respond to the growing significance economically of China. So what does one see? I mean, these, I have to say, broad generalizations about differences between Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, and as I put in as a caveat, obviously there are differences between individual states, but there's a tendency for Latin American states to be more democratic or stable than many states in sub-Saharan Africa, to have more state capacity, for trade unions to be better organized and stronger in Latin America, for civil society to be more mobilized. And that has some consequences in terms of the extent to which states are able to exercise or attempt to exercise control over their economic relations with China. I mean, one, to try and provide a concrete example is in terms of protection and governments taking anti-dumping measures against imports of Chinese goods for being subsidized in China. Now, one finds that that's quite common in Latin America, particularly in the more industrialized Latin American countries, in Brazil, Mexico, Argentina. They'd often take cases against China to the World Trade Organization. In contrast, in Africa, I think apart from South Africa, which did attempt to restrict imports from China, I think there's only one case in the whole of the rest of sub-Saharan Africa where there's been, and that was in Zambia, where there was a measure against, or a case brought against China for dumping. No, another difference is in terms of work permits. I mean, the complaints about Chinese firms bringing in workers to Africa. In fact, State Grid, the Chinese energy company that I talked about earlier in Brazil, did want to bring in 11,000 Chinese workers to help build transmission lines from the Belo Monte Dam in Brazil. And the Brazilian government refused to issue the work permits. So, there is a kind of local agency in these situations that might affect the outcomes. And in general, I think there's more scrutiny and resistance to Chinese projects by civil society in Latin America than in Africa. I mean, recently there's a case of the interoceanic canal in Nicaragua, which seems to have now stalled, but which gave rise to a lot of environmental opposition. Okay, right, I've really run out of time, so these are just my general conclusions. Obviously, China's become more significant for both sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. And I think one does have to recognize that there's not some sort of centralized strategic effort of the Chinese state, but is much more dispersed in terms of the actors involved. And that you also have to look at what I've just been talking about, local agency in terms of interpreting these outcomes and relations. That's the problem with both sides of these polarized views that I set out at the beginning, either an official Chinese view or the critical Western view, is that they tend to think of relations with Africa and with Latin America as being essentially the same. But in fact, these relations do differ in ways that I've tried to bring out, and the impacts also differ on terms as a result of a range of differences, not between China's expansion, if you like, but between the conditions that you find in Latin America and in Africa and within individual countries. Okay, thank you.